My name is Jonathan Perlman. I am the editor of the Jewish Quarterly. I am coming to you tonight from Sydney, Australia, where, as we do here in Australia, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I'm coming from, the Gadigal people. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this event. It's been a year since the relaunch of the Jewish Quarterly, which is an almost 70-year-old British publication that is now, as you can see tonight, an international publication. Our aim is to feature some of the world's greatest long-form writing and reviews by the world's greatest writers. And I'm thrilled that we have two of them here tonight. Rachel Kadish and Kaiser will be introduced later, but I'm so proud to have featured their two remarkable pieces in our latest issue. Their pieces address the main theme of this issue, which looks at the Jewish world of pre-war Europe and efforts to revive and retrace and remember that world. And our intention at Jewish Quarterly is to avoid polemics and echo chambers and sort of point scoring debates. There's plenty of that already. We want to feature great quality writing that explores culture and extends readers' horizons. And I think both Rachel and Menachem live up to that ideal in their pieces, which you'll be hearing about and they'll be discussing tonight. I'm so excited that this is our first event partnering with the Jewish Book Council. It's an incredible organisation which celebrates and promotes and explores Jewish literature and culture. And these are aims and values which really are very much in league with those of the Jewish Quarterly. I'd like now to introduce the Jewish Book Council's Executive Director, Naomi Firestone-Teeter. Naomi, it's great to be working with you tonight. We're really honoured and grateful to be partnering with the Jewish Book Council for this event. Thanks so much to you and your team for making this event happen. And over to you. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm so pleased to be able to welcome you this evening now on behalf of Jewish Book Council. We're thrilled to be able to partner with our friends at the Jewish Quarterly to celebrate the release of their new issue with two authors whom we greatly admire at JBC. Thank you to our partners at JQ, Maurice Schwartz, Jonathan Perlman, and Michelle Wenig, and to Evie Sapphire Bernstein and Becca Cantor at Jewish Book Council for helping to coordinate this evening's special event. Like the new issue of the Jewish Quarterly, the new issue of JBC's annual literary journal, Paper Brigade, explores what it means to look back and question the historical narrative in order to create an even fuller and richer picture of Jewish history and Jewish identity, raising thought-provoking questions about how the past can help us gain a new understanding of who we are as individuals and as a community. If you haven't had a chance to read the new issue, I encourage you to grab a copy. You can find a link in the chat. And lucky for us, today's conversation will be moderated by JBC's editorial director, Becca, who will guide us through Rachel's and Menachem's contributions to the Jewish Quarterly and how that work intersects with our own at JBC. Our mission at Jewish Book Council is to educate, enrich, and strengthen the community through Jewish literature. You can visit our website to learn about our reviews, essays, and Paper Brigade, our book club resources and author tours, and our literary awards, including the National Jewish Book Awards and Natan Notable Books. I hope you would check out all of our programs and resources and consider becoming a member to support JBC's continued initiatives. A few quick housekeeping notes before I pass the baton. If you would like to ask a question of our panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please also be on the lookout in the chat for the links to purchase this evening's books, the new issue of the Jewish Quarterly, and Paper Brigade. And please note that if you do need captions or would like captions, you can add them by clicking at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to introduce you to Becca. Becca Cantor is the editorial director of Jewish Book Council and its annual literary journal, Paper Brigade. She received a master's degree in creative writing from the University of East Anglia in England, and she was a Fulbright Fellow in Estonia. Over to you, Becca.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and thank you to everyone watching today. It's such an honor to be here celebrating the February issue of the Jewish Quarterly. I'm thrilled to be joined by two incredible authors who've contributed essays to the issue, Rachel Kadish and Kaiser. Rachel Kadish is the author most recently of The Weight of Ink, which was awarded a National Jewish Book Award, an America Jewish Libraries Fiction Award, and the Italian Jewish Adelina della Pergola Literary Prize. Her work has appeared in the New York Times and on National Public Radio, and she's been a fiction fellow of the National Endowment for the Arts. Kaiser is the author of Plunder. He holds an MFA from the University of Michigan, and he was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania, actually at the same time that I was in Estonia. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York Magazine, and elsewhere. Rachel and Menachem, thank you both so much for being here. How are you?
Very good. Thank you for having us.
Doing wonderfully.
That is wonderful. Well, just to start off, I wonder if you could each tell me a bit about your article for the Jewish Quarterly and what inspired it. So maybe Menachem, just going in alphabetical order, let's start with you.
I think, am I ahead of Rachel? It's very close.
Well, I guess I was doing it by first name, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, so my article traces the history of an archive that I think it's fair to say was probably the most significant Jewish archive in pre-war Eastern Europe. That was in Vilnius, which is a modern-day Lithuania, but in those years, what was in Poland. The archive in question belonged to YIVO. It was a sort of earlier iteration of the YIVO that exists today on 16th Street in Manhattan. And so that pre-war archive was of one of the sort of most extraordinary documentary histories of what contemporary life was like for Eastern European Jewry. And so they had anything from lullabies to like shul programs to school curricula to eyewitness accounts of pogroms. And my piece in Jewish Quarterly traces the history of what happened. So there was a remarkable story of when the Nazis came in, they immediately looted much of the sort of the libraries and the museums. And the YIVO library was like either systematically looted or just sort of things were just haphazardly destroyed. And so there was a really remarkable story of a lot of these documents and books being smuggled out of the YIVO building and into the ghetto where they were hidden. After the war, these were saved, they were salvaged, and sort of gathered up by Jewish partisans who founded what I believe is the first Holocaust museum, which existed in 1945 in Vilnius in Lithuania. And then, as far as sort of, let's call it the American, as far as the existing YIVO officials knew about that at the time, all those documents were lost when that museum was closed in 1949. And so the piece traces the history of what happened to those documents. In fact, they were saved by a Lithuanian librarian, and then they were sort of rediscovered in the late 80s. And then this set off a 25-year dispute, let's call it like a simmering dispute between Lithuanian officials and YIVO over who these documents belong to. And then sort of the triumphant end of it is there's a project that just was completed or is near completion just a few weeks ago, actually, of a massive digitization. I can never say that word properly. It's a very tricky word. Digitization effort to scan all the material that's in Lithuania, all the material that's in New York, and to virtually reunite the artifacts. And so that is that's sort of a bird's eye view of the piece.
That is perfect. Thank you so much, Menachem. And Rachel, would you like to describe your essay?
I'm glad to. And by the way, for those who haven't yet read it, Menachem's piece is really stunning. It's I highly recommend. I really was. It was so moving to read it. So my essay is called Love and Restitution, and it's really my attempt at the restitution of a story of someone I loved against the backdrop of a property restitution claim. My great-grandparents owned a hotel on the Polish-Czech border. It was an elegant ballrooms and balconies kind of place with a kosher kitchen. So it was a gathering place for a Jewish community of Krakow down near the mountains by the Czech border. When Hitler invaded, My grandmother was a young woman, recently married, and she and her parents and her sisters and their spouses were on the run. To condense a very long story, they were on the run for about 2 years. They were in a Russian prison. They received visas from Tion, the Japanese diplomat who saved thousands of Jewish refugees. And they ended up spending 2 years in Mexico, where my mother was born, and they ended up in New York City. And when I was growing up, so I had these refugee relatives in New York. I actually lived with my parents for a little while, my grandparents for a little while when I was very small. And my grandmother died very young. She died when I was very young. And I think her health never really recovered from what she went through during the war. And I always wanted to know more about my grandmother's story, but it was very hard for people to talk about her. I think she broke a lot of people's hearts. She was, what happened to her? She was beautiful and bright. She was a rule breaker and a groundbreaker, a barrier breaker. She studied law in Poland at a time when young women did not get degrees in law. She was the first in her family to refuse an arranged marriage. And I was always trying to find out more of her story. In the meanwhile, in the background, I was sort of vaguely aware that my older relatives had been for a long while pursuing property claims on their home in Krakow and on the hotel. Now, when the Germans had invaded, the Nazis took the hotel. They claimed it as a, quote, ownerless property, used it as barracks for Nazi soldiers. And after the war, it was made into a high school. It became the high school of the town in Poland where it was. And the story of my great aunt's pursuit of this claim is long and complicated. And by the time I became aware of it, they had become pretty despairing of regaining the property. My own hunger to understand my grandmother's story took me to Poland a couple of times. I ended up asking around a lot about restitution and reparation claims, learning more and more about how complicated they are. I actually got into the hotel. My brother and I put on backpacks at one point and walked in along with the high school students. That didn't last long. And along the way, I met many people, but most significantly to me, I met someone who held a piece of my grandmother's story. His name was Raphael Scharf. I didn't know until I wrote this essay that he was actually one of the people who helped found the Jewish Quarterly in London in the 1950s. But what I did know was that he was one of the main collectors of memory of Jewish Krakow, making sure that the diaries and the photographs were preserved. He gave tours to Jewish students and to students of Jewish Krakow of the community he had survived. And he was one of the most philosophical, soulful people I ever met. And when we first met, he said to me, "I could have been your grandfather, but your grandmother chose much better." He told me the story that they had dated for 2 years in the 1930s in Krakow. One did not date for 2 years in Jewish Krakow without intention to marry. And as he told me the story, he was young, not ready to get married, this big family and the hotel and everything. And he ran off to England to study. And he said to me, "Your grandmother was remarkable. I've never met anyone like her. And I credit her with saving my life," because that was why, as he told me the story, that was why he was in London when Hitler invaded. It's a very romantic story. He told it to me in New York. He told it to me in Krakow. He took me to the cafe where he left her crying. He sat me at the table where he left her crying. He gave tours of student groups, and he brought student groups to the cafe and to that table and told them this story. But the story shifted as he told it. And one of the things that I learned along the way is that whether you're talking about property restitution or restitution of stories, these are very complicated things and hard to grasp, and they're not always what you think they're going to be. And in the course of the essay, a lot of things are demolished, and what I keep coming back to, the heart of the essay and the heart of the question for me is, what can be restored? And when you're left holding only fragments, what do you do with the fragments that are in your hands?
Rachel, that's beautiful. And on that topic, I had actually wanted to ask you guys, both of your essays address this idea of repair or atonement for the past, as well as this idea of restitution. So what to you is the relationship between these two concepts? Does restitution always lead to repair?
Should we jump in any order? It doesn't.
Any order you would desire.
Well, I guess I'll just jump in and say, I don't think, at least in the situations I've looked at and experienced, repair almost becomes an impossible concept, as does justice. I don't know what these words mean in this context. And even if you can get back a building or the documents or the work of art, or I think it's the only way I can think of it is really that it's not actually the end of the narrative. It doesn't restore anything, but it opens up a new opportunity. And what are you going to use that opportunity for? You know, will you fill the building with music and Jewish art? What will you use the archives for? Because if you think of it as the end of a storyline, nothing things are never going to be completely restored.
Yeah. Also, I just want to add, just to echo how beautiful Rachel's piece is, and like just tackles these questions from like such a refracted and fragmentary way, and like it's like I don't know, I just really loved how it took something and made it atmospheric, and I really appreciate it. So really kudos, Rachel. Yeah, the thing with the piece that I was really focusing on these documents, which are very tangible items that are sitting in Lithuania that have been sort of being wrestled over and debated about, and like the question of who owns them. And what's interesting about these is that you could sort of separate, there's a tension between the documents themselves as artifacts, as pieces of paper, as things that maybe belong in museums, versus sort of the content that they hold. And that's why the fact that they're like being digitally reunited sort of gets at that heart of the tension. On one hand, we're saying, great, now we now have access to them. They've been preserved, they've been uploaded. You can now read them in order. You could sort of reassemble documents that had been scattered. On the other hand, there's still something very sharp and almost painful about the fact that they are not being restituted. So I'm sort of twisting your question in the way that I understand it better. But I found the fact that like there was so much focus today on the fact that they are being digitized, they are being reunited. But I became more and more, as I wrote this piece, I became more and more interested in this question of documents as artifacts. And is that being lost? And sort of that value, which is a much harder value to define. Those qualities they're intangible. They require something. They require sort of the way you would talk about sentimental objects or art in order to appreciate what those qualities are. And it's much more elusive, but to me, it's sort of much more interesting and really, to be honest, much more thrilling. As like, what are we trying to reclaim? What are we trying to repossess? What are we trying to sort of preserve? But I do, yeah, this question of repair versus restoration to me is like a very rich one.
Yeah, and I think on a sort of related note, I was really struck by the number and the nuances of all of these different competing claims on the documents and buildings after the war. And in particular, Menachem, in your essay, there's this debate around whether the documents hidden by the Paper Brigade are the cultural heritage, so to say, of Lithuania, the country in which they're found, or YIVO, which is a Jewish organization. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, there's a pretty straightforward, well, it's not straightforward at all. I take that back. There's an argument, and you're saying YIVO is claiming, these belong to YIVO before the war. They should belong to YIVO after the war, given that YIVO New York is a successor organization to YIVO Vilna. And so there's a line of continuity there, and things, let's say kind of more or less according to the precedents established after the war, more or less should be returned to YIVO. Lithuania has, a pretty straightforward counterclaim along the lines of like, look, this was in Lithuania. It's still Lithuanian heritage. Restitution laws from most wars with some treaties more or less ratifying this is that items should be returned or should stay in their country of origin. And so Lithuania is like, this is Lithuanian heritage. And, I think, I come from the background where I come from, like with like sort of like Jewish, let's say, material and Jewish history. I think there is a very reflexive, we're like, oh, they should be returned to YIVO for sure. And it was a challenge to sort of like meet the Lithuanian librarians and hear their side. And I think they do belong to YIVO. The stuff that was YIVO's before the war should be returned to YIVO. But I think it's sort of, there's a certain responsibility to take those claims as generously as we can. And so, this idea, but it really speaks to a much larger question of like, when we talk about these histories, who does it belong to? And so, the ideal is that the countries, Lithuania, other Eastern European countries, step up and recognize in sort of in like a full spirited way that their Jewish history is not a separate history, but is in fact like very much part of their own cultural heritage, which is generally not the case. And so then you have like a whole other set of questions of tokenization and sort of exploitation and stuff that sort of looks like celebration and commemoration, but is in fact being used to like for other more self-serving purposes. And yeah, it becomes very, very quickly a mess. And but these specific documents ended up being a very sort of interesting portal into those.
Yeah, thank you. It was just absolutely fascinating. All the nuances that are just so interesting to me, and I think you just do a wonderful job of articulating all of them. And Rachel, I was wondering what you think about this too, and also a theme that sort of seemed to go throughout your piece as well, as this idea of legal versus emotional claims on the past.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that I'm certainly not the expert on how legal claims go in Poland, and there are many other people who know much more about that than I do. It is very, very messy, and in Poland you have the situation where, of course, there were all the intervening decades of communism and some properties being nationalized and all kinds of other issues in there, it's extraordinarily complicated. I have tended to focus. I fully supported my family in pursuing the claim in whatever way they wanted to and needed to. And for me, I was interested in what I think of as emotional restitution, the sort of understanding the story, trying to understand. I mean, my family were very patriotic Poles as well as very committed Jews, and loved Poland. My grandfather, the first thing he did when Hitler invaded was go enlist as a physician to try to help with the Polish army. And so what do you do with that after everything? I think one thing, and this is maybe a bit of a, I'm not sure if this exactly answers your question, but when I think about the emotional restitution piece, one thing that's very important to me is to constantly really try to remember that our response to the dehumanization that the Nazis inflicted and the sort of taking away the humanity or attempting to take away the humanity of the Jews, our response really shouldn't be a reflexive response to tell their stories only as perfect angels, saints. As far as I know, Judaism doesn't believe in saints, right? That because that's another form of dehumanization. And so I feel that it's very important, to whatever degree we can have a restitution of stories, that we tell their stories as real people, which means complex people with flaws and all. I think it's easy to forget that even, you look at Anne Frank's diaries, she's talking about her flaws. She's not, pretending to be a perfect person. And I think it's very important when we try to go back to these stories to restore their full humanity the best we can.
I think that's so wise. And one thing that I just wanted to touch on before we go into more about the idea of writing these stories and how that figures into all of these ideas, one of the things that I find so interesting about your two essays is how they overlap with each other's previous work. So Rachel, your article is about the attempt to reclaim your family's property in Poland, and your most recent book is about discovering and reclaiming documents to a certain extent. And Menachem, it's just the opposite way for you. Your essay is about reclaiming documents, and your book is about the attempt to reclaim your family's property in Poland. So what's the crossover between these quests to take back physical and intellectual property? I know we've touched on this a little bit earlier in the conversation too. And how are those two things different for you?
Say it one more time.
So basically, I guess that I was interested in this overlap between reclaiming physical and intellectual property. And I wondered, are these similar things for you, or are they different in some way as well?
Well, the big difference for me, and I'm very curious if Rachel experienced this similarly, is one, was very personal, or continues to be a very personal, which has like emotional resonance, which has emotional stakes as personal stakes for me, and also as a writer. With the documents, this one, it isn't an individual. So like you can't really hang the narrative on someone, on a person. And so like, it's harder to sort of get at like certain ambitions and motivations and like those stakes and like that was frustration, which is sort of really colors the story of a reclamation effort when it's a person or a family, or especially when it goes generation to generation. It's a sovereign government versus an institution, which not to say it's not sort of exciting and doesn't have emotional stakes, but it's a degree removed. But I do find that sort of jumping back and forth between those two really interesting, because I think it sort of puts into relief these questions of politics or like legal realities, or when you have, let's call them historical politics, and we sort of like debate what things mean. But yeah, the overlap gets, I don't know, Rachel, what do you think?
Well, for me, I think the overlap maybe is a little more direct, because it's sort of the same issue through both. Only one's nonfiction, the other's fiction. And even though I wrote my novel, The Weight of Ink, before writing this essay, still obviously this essay comes out of experiences from when I was small. So I guess we all have our, say our obsessions, or we can call them themes, but something I think that has always concerned me is when you're holding just fragments, what can you repair? Can we get back these lives, and particularly these lives of women that are lost, that are and we think we're never going to get back. And what if you could get some pieces of them back? And I wouldn't have said this at the start of writing The Weight of Ink, but when I finished writing the whole thing, because I try not to think too directly about themes when I write fiction, because I feel like otherwise I would be writing very woodenly, as if I was trying to prove a point. So I just write, I sort of improvise, and at the end I look back and I say, oh, those were the themes. So at the end of the Weight of Ink, I realized, well, what did I write? I wrote about what fragments are left of this woman's life after, in this case, 17th century, Inquisition refugee, and can we retrieve her story, and what can we make of it in this great, grand, big house? So that template is all there. It's like you took the blueprint of what I grew up with Holocaust survivor refugees, and you put it in a great house found in London from the 17th century with Inquisition refugees and these fragments. And can you rebuild a story and interact with that life? And in a way I always felt in writing Weight of Ink, and just as in life, where if you think about history and you really take it to heart, then those stories are in your hands, and you have to decide what to do with them, and you have to let them change you, so that the way history can change us and we can try to rebuild those stories, I guess, is a theme.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I love that idea of thinking about it too as fiction versus nonfiction, which I hadn't really thought of before, and I really love that, framing it in that way. So I sort of wanted to return, Menachem, you had mentioned before something at the beginning that I wanted to touch on, that eventually the documents that you write about are digitized so that scholars can access them outside Lithuania, but you point out that a digital document isn't really the same thing at all as the original. And I'd like you to read a passage from your essay that sort of touches on this and describes this.
Sure. There are downsides to digitization. Any iteration introduces errors, and important paratextual information, like a handwritten note on the back of the document, may not be captured. But most researchers consider these trade-offs acceptable. Though there is also something discomforting about holding up digital scans as satisfactory or even superior substitutes for the original. Maybe, in terms of scholarship, all that matters is being able to read the document. Who cares if it's on a screen? But scholarship is hardly the only metric. The story of these objects is a material story. These books, these documents were smuggled, hidden, buried, unburied, salvaged. Their story is imprinted onto them, and it's a story that can be experienced or felt or intuited only in non-virtual proximity. They are not unlike art in that sense, or any objects with extra textual, historical, or sentimental value.
Thank you so much. I love that description. It's beautiful. I wonder, can you tell us a little bit more about why it's important to treat documents as physical artifacts as art as well as intellectual objects?
I think it's, pretty, I think anyone who's been in an archive or even in a museum, like, knows this intuitively. And so, the next paragraph recounts an anecdote that Cecile Kuznets, who's a professor and wrote the definitive history of Evo, she told me this like really revealing, really interesting story about going through the microfilm and seeing a scan of the same book multiple times, like duplicates of the same book. And, from a content point of view, it doesn't make sense. It's a waste of microfilm. It's just the same book. And she was told that the reason it was included was that Sutskever had scribbled a note on one of those copies that said this had been saved in the Vilna ghetto. And to me, that sort of really illuminated, the idea of like, we could have a book, but a book isn't merely just what's in it. The books are objects. And so like the fact that it traveled from the Evo building and was hidden in the Vilna ghetto and then was saved by Antanas Ulpis, the Lithuanian librarian, and there was, that managed to get smuggled out by Sutskever Kaczynski and somehow got back to Evo. I'm not going to relate to that book as merely, words strung together on pages. Like it's not the same thing. And, we have just a very, very long tradition of treating books as something more than content holders. And so, the fact that these people saved their lives for these books, I feel it means something. And it's very hard to articulate what that is, because you're just trying to hold on to value, which is trickier. And it's funny. It feels in a way a very contemporary question. And so we like the fact that there's a transition going on.
Yeah, it could not have happened in any other era. This question would not have.
Yeah, there was, they're doing this like monumental effort, Evo, and it's really commendable. But some of them are kind of interesting. So you have a book and you scan it, but then they're also scanning objects. I don't think I mentioned this in the piece, but they have like a box. Laser Rand, who was an historian who went back to Vilnius after the war, he took some of the ashes that the Evo building, where the Evo building once stood, and he put it in this wooden box. So there's like scraps of paper and actual ashes, and he brought it back to New York, and it's in the Evo archive. And this is one of the objects that they took like high quality 3D scans of, and that's sort of it's a virtual museum object. And I found that one really interesting and much harder to relate to as a digital object, because I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? It's like, I could see what it looks like in high resolution, but I was like, this sort of matters that it exists. And so, yeah, I've heard of other digital archives where they just started destroying the books, actually, because they're like, what's the point? Like we don't need them anymore. I don't think no one's doing it with like historically important books, but it's still sort of, maybe not breathtaking. It gives one pause when you're saying, okay, the digital thing substitutes, because I don't know, man, I don't know, maybe in 50 years, like these sort of like sentiments will shift and we actually will regard those digital objects as different. And then, it gets very contemporary. So you look at like, we are actually starting trading to like an NFT, like something that is considered, is tradable, is like the closest you could get the tangible of an intangible item. But I don't know, for me, I'm just kind of old school like that. I'm just going to consider a book to be a book, and it's great to access it, but it's something very valuable and like and it just means something. You could feel it.
Absolutely. And Rachel, I think that you seem to would like to jump in. And I was thinking about this also kind of in terms of the weight of ink a little bit, even though it doesn't relate maybe as much directly to your essay, but it certainly seems to come into your other writing.
Yeah, all I was going to say is we need to just have like a 3-hour conversation now about libraries and archives, and just the experience of having a chance to view 17th century documents and the difference. I mean, I can't imagine reading those on a scan and what you would miss. Yeah.
I had a very personal, because years before I spent a lot of years researching the Vilna Ghetto. And so there's something very personal for me. And some of these books I encountered, I never saw the originals. And then in this reporting the story, I actually did. I was able to see the original, and it's not the same. Like it is really not the same. And so you could really feel it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And just, I agree with everything that you guys have said. And and as we're sort of nearing the halfway mark of our discussion a little bit, I kind of wanted to zoom out to the larger theme of the conversation, which is writing Europe before the Holocaust. What do you feel is the role of writing itself? And this is also something that was touched on earlier in the conversation. What do you feel is the role of writing itself in reclaiming a vanished world? And Rachel, I was thinking about this particularly in the context of one thing in your piece. So in the last issue of JBC's annual literary journal, Paper Brigade, Muriel Rothman-Zecker wrote an article in which he talks about the challenge of writing about pre-war Europe in fiction without backshadowing, so without superimposing our knowledge of the tragedy that's to come. And I wonder, Rachel, if you could read the opening of your essay, which for me really engages with this challenge.
Okay, sure. The long scrape of a skate on a frozen pond. Lamplight cast onto the snow through lace-curtained windows. Horses' hooves thudding. In the sled under robes ride the elder Herzogs. Behind, tethered to the sled by tow ropes, ski the Herzog daughters, perhaps all four, perhaps only two or three. The sisters shout to each other, eyes watering from cold wind and laughter as they weave between the horses' droppings. In the summer, there is tennis, hiking, 5:30 dancing, Chopin and Dvorak and news broadcasts, all emanating from the cabinet-sized radio, polished as a piano. Let me try again. Sled, horses, dancing. If ink on paper can reassemble a world, if the shards of detail, gathered with care, can constitute a vessel to hold her heartbreak and her heart.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful. So in showing these different repeated attempts at describing your grandmother's life, what did you want to capture?
You know, it's I'm not religious, but when I approach this material, I always think of Psalm 19. May the words of my mouth and the efforts of my heart possibly be sufficient to this material, because we're trying to put words on material that the people who, in this case, the people who could have and should have told these stories are gone. There are no words that I can ever come up with that will be right or enough for this loss, and yet we have to try. I feel like language may be a poor tool, but it's what we have. And if part of what we're trying to do is repair a shattered vessel here, it's a tool we have to stitch things back together. The question of, can we unknow what we know when we write the lives of people? Can we give them what they deserve, which is the stories of them without the foreshadowing of the war? You know, can I tell my grandmother's story before the war without all the knowledge of what's going to happen? I mean, I think of this essay as sort of my attempt to write a love letter to my grandmother, and where I try to go, sorry, my dog is saying hello here, where I try to go toward the end of the essay is to try, after everything is destroyed, after really the hotel was demolished without my family being notified. And when I discovered it, I'm sitting at my computer online, and it's sort of the body blow of seeing these photographs of the demolition and realizing that it's gone. And at the end of it, and at the end of the essay, I try to go back to a moment before all of that, to restoring an image of who my grandmother was, just a quiet, imagined afternoon when she goes out in the breeze and goes up and follows the stream back into the hills. But of course, even when I try to do that, and I'm describing what she would see, you know, follow the stream up and up, and, you know, until the roads and the churches and the chimneys look small, and dream about the future. And that's what I want to imagine for her. But of course, we cannot imagine roads and chimneys and steeples in Poland of the 1930s without all these other associations. We just can't do it. So we can try to give them what they deserve, which is the beauty and dignity of those lives that did not yet know what was coming, but will always be imperfect at it, I think.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Menachem, do you have anything to add to this? And one thing I also want to flag in particular about your essay is there seems to me this interesting parallel between the post-war efforts to make the collections of documents available to scholars and YIVO's like original intention in creating this collection. I wondered if you could, you spoke about it a little bit in the beginning, but I wonder if you could tell us more about how the collection was meant to capture pre-war Jewish life. Well, at the moment, they didn't know it was pre-war Jewish life, and how we might view the contents of the documents differently now with hindsight.
Yeah, YIVO was a groundbreaking institution. It was founded in 1925 and it's sort of, if like Yiddish, let's call it Yiddish scholarship, was at its infancy. And so this idea of sort of recognizing the sort of the daily goings on of Eastern European Jews was worthy of study. I think the neatest, it doesn't like, we would slot it into most neatly today, like sociology. But back then it was like philology. It was like the use of language. It was the use of ritual, of practice, of music, and just really just getting a snapshot. And so the most successful program they had was something called the Sammler program, which deputized lay people all over Poland and beyond to send in any items, really anything. And they, within, the numbers are really extraordinary. Within like a couple of years, they had like 10,000 items, and within like 5 years, it was something like 50,000 items. And these could be scraps of papers from shuls. These could be speeches that were given. These could be minutes from like political groups. And this was like just, and the Weinreich and the other founders of YIVO understood, they understood that this was something worth studying, which is, it's, in retrospect, it seems almost tragically obvious. This is something that we're all sort of desperately trying to reassemble. But it was a real stroke of perspective. It was something that, again, like a groundbreaking institution. And so, these documents, which were quotidian, which were very regular in the 30s, all of a sudden take on extraordinary historical value now. And these are, it is very, very hard to see past the war, the Holocaust. It's very it eclipses everything. And so but it's very important. It's something that, and it's something I, growing up, going to the schools I did, learning what I did, it's something that was very opaque to me. I had like a sort of shtetl version of things, wherever I learned that. But like, what was it like in the 20s and the 30s? What were like the politics? Like, what was the home like? And, to sort of correct for sort of like fantasy versions or sentimental versions, or something that's saccharine, or something that's sort of overly informed by the Holocaust, when the Holocaust was like 20 years down the line. These are, again, as one scholar put it, this is perhaps the most important, as David Fishman put it, this is perhaps the most important discovery in Jewish scholarship since the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so they have the opportunity to completely allow us to sort of reimagine and reapproach most every facet of Jewish life before the war in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me. I mean, I think that to me it is almost impossible to get past World War II, but I feel like with documents like this and with writing that's really good in every way, that's sort of our closest chance of being able to capture that time, or to understand that time as best as we can without the context of what came after. So it's just so interesting to hear both of your thoughts on that. I know it's now 7:45, and I want to give everyone a chance to ask their own questions. If anyone has a question in the audience, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. In the meantime, I have one last question for you guys, which is that both of your narratives, and Rachel, we were just talking about this, they end kind of without a clear resolution. How do you view that lack of conclusion as writers as well as researchers? And if you could write your own ideal conclusion, what would it be?
Well, I mean, to write an ideal conclusion to this kind of story, there's no ideal conclusion that doesn't unwind time and rewind it in a different way. I mean, there's no there's no, reparation will never fully repair. Restitution will never truly give something back. So, I think, look, I can imagine if, a version of the story where events had gone differently, where the hotel became a center for the Jewish arts and the Polish-Czech border and educating people and, bringing all kinds of, but the lack of resolution, I think, is both in my case, because I don't have more information, but also because fundamentally it'll never be my story to tell. That the people who could have told the story are gone, and so we have only partial stories going forward, and yet we go forward. And if it's not up to us to complete the task and all of that, but we have to engage with it.
No, my story, in contrast to Rachel's, like a somewhat more straightforward journalistic investigation of what happened, and it is a non-resolution. Those documents are staying in Lithuania. Yivo has not officially renounced any claims on it. It is still an ongoing matter. But really speaking, bigger, I think if these stories have a resolution, then you probably haven't told them properly. These stories just do not have resolutions. They're a resolution suggests a real neatness or catharsis or redemption. And it's just never the case. That's been my experience, with my book, with this piece, with spending time in Eastern Europe. Stories of going back in time to try and sort of redeem or do justice or anything, it just will get messy. And I actually think that's where it gets interesting and rich and beautiful, when if these things aren't resolvable.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I had one observation that it struck me when I was reading both of your essays, is an essay in the last issue of Paper Brigade, where Joshua Cohen is talking about the idea that, in many narratives, in many Western narratives, you see a narrative as being this sort of line of everything progressing and getting better, whereas Jewish narratives tend to be circles of whatever it is, either like a cycle of a year or a holiday or cycles of anti-Semitism or whatever it is. And I think that seems especially pertinent to this kind of conversation as well, that there isn't really a possible resolution or high point. So I want to get to some audience questions because they're all fantastic. Nina writes here, do we lose something even greater than the physical assets when we focus on reclaiming them? E.g., the truth of the history itself, which is under constant and increasing assault. If we can only have one, would we ever choose the bricks and mortar once owned? Should we?
If I understand the question, which I'm not sure I do, but I think these are just intertwined. And as a writer, and in the book, in the piece, this is the way in. I just you have to sort of get at these questions. You have to raise these issues, and you want to immerse yourself. And there's just these questions of ownership, or this kind of excuses to ask much more interesting and bigger questions. So I don't know. I don't know a scenario which would be an either or, but maybe I just don't have the imagination.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't, if things were right and just, no one would ever have to choose. I can turn myself into a human pretzel trying to understand my way around restitution and reparation claims, and what I think doesn't even matter, because it's up to the people who made the claims, and they can pursue it in whatever way is most meaningful to them. And that was how I felt about, my relatives. And I knew survivors who wanted to pursue claims and survivors who didn't want to pursue claims. So I think we just sort of start with whatever pieces we're holding and try to hold on and build from there.
Yeah, and I have one, which, whoops, I kind of lost it, sorry, that I wanted to ask. Megan asked, of the different people in your essays, who's one that really stood out to you, or one that you wish that you could write more about? Not I see you thinking of all the different possibilities.
Well, the truth is to me the most compelling figure, and not historical, and those guys, the guys who are doing this, the guys who are smuggling the documents and during the war are obviously incredibly compelling characters. But there's a guy, Emanuel Zingaris, and he is the most politically powerful Jew in Lithuania, and his brother is like the second most politically powerful Jew in Lithuania, and they've sort of like been there in these positions since the late 80s, and they are very, very compelling people. And they talk to me, and then they stop talking to me in reporting this piece, so I actually didn't get any real interviews. But like those kind of power dynamics, and they have all these shifting allegiances, like to the Lithuanian Jewish community, to the government, to the diaspora, to other governments. And so yeah, I find them very, very compelling.
Yeah, definitely. I was very intrigued by them as I read your piece. Rachel.
Well, my first answer will be obvious, which is, my grandmother, of course, and Felek. And what's interesting to me is that I wrote this essay and I thought, well, that's all I will ever know about these people and their story. And in the few weeks since this has come out, I've had just the most wonderful conversations with people who knew Felek, and I've learned more about him, about my grandmother, conversations with families. So I'm not used to writing nonfiction. It turns out when you put nonfiction out in the world, many of us are carrying different pieces of the story and sort of put things together. So that has been really remarkable. But the other thing is, I was very close to my grandmother's younger sister, my great aunt Lily, and she appears in this essay only as really the little girl who fell asleep on the chairs at the corner of the ballroom during her older sister's wedding. But there's so many powerful stories that she told me over the years, and we lost her just at the start of the pandemic. There's so much, and I just couldn't. That's for a different essay and a different day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really sorry to hear that. I have actually a couple different people asking about the connection. This is really kind of interesting. The connection between the YIVO documents and the Cairo Geniza. Like sort of, I think in more sort of, not that they're actually related, but I think I have people asking like, do you see them as some sort of a similar concept, or like how do those two discoveries kind of work together for you?
Well, I'll just plainly admit I know very little about the Cairo Geniza, so I can't really say.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think it's this, I'm definitely not an expert on it either, but it's this whole cache of documents that were discovered in Cairo, Geniza. So it's similarly, I think, in a way to what you described, just all sorts of documents. They're documents that are meant to be kind of thrown away in a sense. So like, little slips of paper and invoices and things, but from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So, and then I think really shed a lot of light on the everyday life of people in that area. So sort of like a sort of different experience of Jews in a different part of the world. And I do think that there are a lot of really interesting parallels there. So that's really interesting to me. Rachel, and on something that you mentioned before, someone asks, how is it for you, and I think you sort of touched on this, but how is it for you moving from fiction to nonfiction?
I tend to, nonfiction is hard. It's, it's a different set of challenges, and I think, I guess my own quirk about it is I really don't like being on the page. I don't like to write about myself. And so it felt very strange to step forward and do that. I'll write about, if there's an issue I'm connected to, I'll put myself in only as so far as I think I need to talk about the issue. But in this case, I'm writing about my grandmother, and you can't write about someone you love without being personal. And I have my childhood memories of her, which were very physical. And I had, after she died, a recurrent dream that I probably had for about 20 years about going back to the family home, and I'm too late and everyone's been taken. And I go looking for my grandmother, so that is, it feels very exposed in a way that I'm not used to. And also I feel an enormous amount of responsibility writing about real people. And I'm sure I got things wrong. I mean, I tried and I double and triple checked everything. And I spoke with people who knew the various people I was writing about, and I probably still got things wrong. And I especially in a case where people were not able to tell their own story, like my grandmother, I take that responsibility very much to heart. So, but then there's this flip side of it, which is that I got a chance to write a love letter to my grandmother and try to tell part of her story and put her beautiful picture. And thank you to the Jewish Quarterly for agreeing to print her picture and all of that. And then now this really remarkable experience I'm having of, I thought the story was done and it's not over, because I'm hearing from people who knew the people I'm writing about.
That's so interesting. And by the way, I want to tell you guys that I'm seeing so much just praise, just no questions attached, but just praise for your books and for you and for this event in the chat. So I just wanted to say, to let you know about that, that's happening here too. And someone actually comments that the Cairo-Geniza documents span a 1,000-year continuum, which I think is very interesting just on this topic. So someone had asked, and I just lost this in the chat, and this is probably going to be the last question I think that we'll have time for, but I wanted to address it because I started to think, Menachem, I wonder if you've also considered maybe writing fiction. Someone in the chat had asked how, when you guys encounter historical materials, and I'm kind of paraphrasing this because I lost the actual question, I apologize to the person who wrote this, but when you encounter these historical artifacts or stories, how do you decide whether to write about them as fiction or as nonfiction? And what are the sort of ethics involved in how you think about that too?
Well, yeah, I mean, a few years ago, I went to graduate school. I got my MFA in fiction writing, and I was pretty adamant that about trying to stick to it. And I only wrote my book, Plun, which came out last year, very reluctantly. Basically the story got too weird to fit into a novel, and I didn't know how to do it. And I was just like, great, I guess I'll just have to try it and write this as a nonfiction book. In terms of the ethics, I don't know. I'm pretty, I err on the side of it's fine, I guess, when it comes to making stuff up. I grant the author a lot of leeway in terms of what she's allowed to do and write about, and sort of the attitude and voice. I think it's that contract gets much trickier when actually it's nonfiction. I think there's certain expectations, and I think certain narrative techniques start getting pretty fuzzy, like in terms of like how we tell our stories. And so you could mislead, or even, let's say, timeline, or sort of like how you present yourself. And every writer has like an eye that is a little bit different than their actual person. And yeah, I mean, there's just lots of people who've written a lot more intelligently on this than I have, but yeah, it can get very tricky very fast. And like, having now written this memoir, when I read memoirs now, I'm starting to see a lot of those patches, let's call them, or the seams are a lot more apparent to me now. And so the question has actually become sharper the more I've been writing nonfiction.
Rachel, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many issues in there, and I was so focused on what Menachem was saying that I think I probably lost track some of the original question. But I think, I'm a little allergic to myself on the page, so I tend to write nonfiction only when I feel like, wow, no, this is real. So I really need to make clear that this is real. Like, and I want to write about something in a nonfiction way for that reason. Fiction for me gives me a little more room to to play, to improvise, to sort of see the themes out of the corner of my eye, not steer directly toward them. And I feel like for me, that's a good way to learn what I actually think of the world or try to put pieces together. With history, sometimes, I mean, you read things that are so compelling, you think, oh my God, somebody's got to write. I mean, I have notebooks full of notes. Someone has to write something about this. I don't know if I can do this one, but and with the fiction, when working with historical material, I'm not sure if this was the question about how much latitude you have in sort of shifting. I think writers can make all kinds of choices, and there's what I think of as the reader-writer contract, not any literal contract, but sort of this sort of understanding that if I say something happened in 1665, you either know that it did because I've sort of established that I am really following the history closely, or you know that it might or might not have because I've announced in some way that I'm being as sort of history-ish. And I think so long as that contract is clear and you know what you're reading as the reader, you know if it's the absolute literal history or you know if someone took liberties, then whatever that agreement is fine. I think the problem comes up when it's not clear, when people sort of imply that they're doing the exact history, but actually they've bent it. I personally feel really strongly about being a real stickler with the history, but that's partly because especially when writing the 17th century book, I feel like there's so many women's lives at the time were not recorded other than marriage, death, birth, maybe giving birth dates. That's it. Everything else is sort of not in the historical record. So I wanted to really try to reconstruct lives making sure I was using the actual history and then imagining the rest around that to try to rebuild what we could. And I didn't want to play fast and loose with history.
I just want to add, I was saying that my favorite line in Rachel's piece, the one that to me announces how honestly is sort of tackling material and how personally is let me try again. And that it becomes clear that she's like, this is slippery material and it's very hard to gain perspective. And the best we could do is sort of have a refracted image somehow. And so it's, to me, as soon as I read that line, I'm like, oh, I'm in. I'm committed to this piece and this voice and this sort of perspective. But that just announced it. It's like, that's the contract.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. I think that's the perfect stopping point. And I just really, really appreciate you both being here. This was absolutely fascinating. And thank you again also to everyone who joined us today. If you're intrigued by what you've heard and you'd like to read more, we're posting the link to purchase the Jewish Quarterly and Paper Brigade in the chat again. Jewish Book Council's next event is the first in this year's Unpacking the Book series. It's a week from today, and it will feature Gal Beckerman and Talia Lavin. You can find a link to register for that in the chat as well, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.
Becca, thank you so much, and Menachem, thank you for being in this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Same.